Yes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Sorry for crashing this panel, but I was really convinced it was my slot. So my name is Daniela Nascimento. I'm a professor, associate professor at University of Coimbra in the Department of International Relations. This is a joint paper with a colleague also from the university, José Manuel Pureza, who is a full professor in the same department. And we have been doing research on issues related to humanitarianism, critical studies on humanitarianism. And our paper is related to a discussion on the evolution of humanitarian action with a specific focus on lessons learned from the case of the United Nations Refugee Agency for the Palestinian Territories, UNRWA. So the research focus of this paper is basically analyzing the evolution of classical neoclassical humanitarianism to neoliberal humanitarianism through the experience of UNRWA in Gaza. The central research question that is in the paper, and this is a draft paper that we've been developing, is how does UNRWA's experience shed light on the ongoing relevance of classical humanitarian principles in a position or versus a version of a more integrated approach to humanitarianism, which has been developed around this idea of the humanitarian development and peace nexus when applied to contemporary conflicts like the one we are unfortunately seeing happen in Gaza, especially since the Hamas attacks of October 23. And of course, the current crisis context is important. The attacks by Hamas in October 23 and the subsequent war in Gaza have intensified attacks against UNRWA, making it a primary target for elimination. There has also been systematic targeting in terms of the funding of UNRWA, in terms especially by the United States, already with the Trump in the first administration, and now increasingly and reinforced in the current administration, but also legislative prohibitions by the Israeli government, physical attacks on facilities, on humanitarian workers, and of course accusations of political bias that reveal deeper tensions within the work of UNRWA. So in our review, in terms of the theoretical significance of the research, we believe that UNRWA's challenges kind of illuminate broader debates about the importance of humanitarian principles versus political integration and a more comprehensive approach to humanitarian action. And that's the point of start of the paper. In terms of the theoretical framing, we of course rely on a framing that resorts to the evolution of both humanitarian discourse and practice throughout the decades. We don't have much time, but of course, it all starts through a focus on the so-called classical approach to humanitarianism, the so-called Dunantist approach that takes us back to the mid-19th century with the heritage of Henri Dunant. But in a nutshell, classical approach to humanitarian action relies on core principles of action, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, with a focus on needs-based assistance and protection through neutrality. So the idea that humanitarian organizations, through this classical approach, they perform their work through neutrality, so not taking sides in the conflict that is kind of sustaining a specific crisis. The evolution of classical humanitarianism throughout the decades led to some criticism in relation to neutrality specifically. And so in the 90s, up until the 2000s, a new conception of humanitarianism emerged called or named New Humanitarianism, which is very different from the classical one. It is clearly rights-based, politically engaged, and very focused on addressing root causes of conflict and transforming power relations. So there is a shift in terms of the overall goals of the work and the purpose of humanitarian organizations and humanitarian action that should no longer be relying on immediate relief, short-term relief to the victims. And then in this last period, from the 2000s until today, we would say, there has been this emergence of a more neoliberal humanitarianism. And this is when the so-called humanitarian peace and development nexus emerges, very much focused on an integrated, fused approach of humanitarian peace and development objectives through coordination and complementary intervention. So the lines between these different types of intervention get blurred for the sake of a more integrated approach to humanitarian action. This idea that we should not be defining too clear borders between the different types of action. It should all be merged and integrated in a more comprehensive approach that could combine short-term, medium-term, and longer-term objectives to humanitarian organizations. Of course, the debate at some point ends up stressing the value of core humanitarian principles. And just for the sake of clarity, we do not argue that or defend the idea that we should go back to the basics and the classical approach to humanitarianism, but we do want to stress out the importance of core fundamental principles when it comes to addressing humanitarian crises. And here, stating very clearly what these principles mean. Humanity, meaning preventing and alleviating human suffering from war or from natural disaster. Neutrality, meaning a refrain from taking sides in hostilities or engaging in political or other type of controversies, aiming at protecting the victims of humanitarian crisis and assuring access to these victims. The idea of impartiality in the sense that there should be no discrimination between victims. Every victim deserves assistance, so impartiality grants this commonality between the victims, regardless of the sides in which they are. And finally, independence, which of course relies significantly on the material dimension of independence, the idea that there is a level of economic, financial autonomy by the organizations that should be maintained. The core of our research relies on this discussion on the humanitarian peace and development nexus. This nexus seeks to bridge, at least in theory, to bridge humanitarian response, peace building and development through coordinated complementary interventions aimed at addressing root causes of crisis rather than merely the symptoms of those crises. There has been the identification and the reliance of this nexus on some key characteristics, the long-term perspective aimed at addressing structural causes, the rights-based approach focusing on transforming power relations and addressing inequalities, a focus on political engagement, so explicitly acknowledging and engaging with political dimensions of the crisis, so the idea that the crises do not occur in a vacuum, an integrated programming, meaning that there should be coordination across humanitarian peace and development sectors, and a very significant emphasis on coherence, this idea that we should ensure complementarity between different types of interventions. And this is very much in line with the relatively old liberal peace debate, this idea that liberal peace should be based on some sort of a mantra of economic and political liberalization with longer term objectives. So we argue that this nexus is very much embedded in the neoliberal approach to peace, development, and of course, it kind of gets embedded also in the debate on humanitarianism. There have been, of course, many tensions and critiques resulting from this evolution, and especially from the implementation of the Nexus agenda. The costs of politicization are clear and significant, and we would identify a couple of them, mostly related with the risk of instrumentalization of aid. The integration of humanitarian aid with political objectives leads or may lead to co-option of aid for non-humanitarian purposes, and that is a problem from the point of view of the victims' needs. So the result is that humanitarian action becomes a tool of foreign policy rather than an expression of universal solidarity towards the victims. Another critique relates to the compromise protection dimension. So the idea that humanitarianism should also protect the victims is blurred with this nexus, because politicization compromises humanitarian access and increases security risks. And there have been lots of debates and discussion and work developed in relation to this so-called bunkerization of aid and increased targeting of aid workers. It's not random that in the last decades, the number of attacks to or directed to humanitarian workers have increased significantly. And this has, of course, to be read as a consequence of this increasing politicization and instrumentalization of humanitarian aid, of humanitarian organizations, and humanitarianism more broadly. So we are kind of confronted with this paradox of protection. Classical principles, in particular neutrality, were designed to provide protection, both victims and aid workers, by maintaining this perception that these organizations are not threatening actors. From the moment political engagement steps in, it undermines this protective function. And I think we can see that very clearly in the case of UNRWA in Gaza, as I will explain very quickly in a minute. So there are a few concerns that also add to this. The loss of distinctive humanitarian character and moral authority, an increased vulnerability to violence and targeting of humanitarian organizations, an erosion of humanitarian space and operational access, and reduced effectiveness in complex emergency contexts. So the case of UNRWA, in our view, is particularly relevant for this discussion. If we think about the origins and the founding context of UNRWA, it was created in 1949 in response to an inability to implement the UN General Assembly Resolution 194 that would establish repatriation rights for approximately 7,000 Palestinian refugees that were expelled during the 1948 war. And the mandate of UNRWA is somehow contradictory from the start. It kind of combines a minimalist approach of humanitarianism, so preventing conditions of starvation and distress for the Palestinian refugees, so clearly classical emergency relief provision mandates, but also combined with a more longer-term mandate to promote conditions for peace and stability, kind of linking to this more structural intervention and development purposes. So this contradiction, in our review, resulted from this compromise that was attempted in the immediate aftermath of the Nakba between a political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and an immediate response to the clearly deteriorating humanitarian situation of the refugees. The evolution of UNRWA's operational work from relief to development to neoliberalism is also very clear. In the 50s, very clearly related or focused on refugee assistance, and then increasingly assuming medium, longer term objectives that are organized in 5 core operational domains: education, health services, relief and social services, and also microcredit programs, which were, of course, a result of the needs of the times, especially taking into consideration the long duration of the Palestinian issue. And this has somehow led to this idea that UNRWA has become a political actor, very much linked to this idea of construction of a Palestinian refugee identity. And here we rely a little bit on Feldman's idea that humanitarian minimalism focused on rations and tents, so food, relief, shelter, constituted an essential instrument in constructing refugees as political actors. This idea that the UNRWA has become also the reflection and the illustration of this paradox, this Dunantist paradox. The classical humanitarian minimalism becomes an instrument of political mobilization and identity preservation, while maintaining a focus on longer-term objectives and sustaining the cause for the Palestinians way beyond the mere provision of humanitarian aid, of relief aid in the short term. So there is a political significance in this move, and the agency continuity supports the strategy of not forgetting displaced status at the same time as providing the necessary conditions or more structural conditions for the Palestinians to endure. The case of UNRWA is also interesting in terms of the debate because it also reflects some sort of a neoliberal turn. And the neoliberal term is very much focused on what we identify as 3 core ideas: containment, so containment of the crisis where they are, avoiding the spillover of those crises; resilience of the victims of this crisis. So the victims become responsible for their own vulnerability; and entrepreneurship. So this idea that since we do not have the capacity to structurally solve this vulnerability of the victims of the crisis, and especially the case of the Palestinians in Gaza, then we have to make sure that they manage to overcome their vulnerability by being resilient and entrepreneurs. There is a fundamental shift in this logic. So that's the transformation from the idea of relief, short-term relief, to longer-term capacity to overcome vulnerability. And this is, in our view, somehow visible in some of the neoliberal characteristics in UNRWA's programming. A containment strategy to keep refugees in temporary host locations rather than addressing displacement root causes, an entrepreneurial focus, an individual responsibility, so making refugees responsible for escaping deprivation conditions, a resilience paradigm, so adapting to the circumstance rather than structural transformation, and of course, market solutions, making sure the private sector can also be engaged and promote economic integration. The critical implication of this is that there is a fundamental shift from collective rights and political solutions towards individual adaptation and market-based response to structural displacement. And we are very critical of that move because we believe it is not sustainable. To conclude, and I'm sorry if I'm taking too long, the October 23 crisis and the systematic targeting of UNRWA is also very relevant. As I mentioned in the beginning, there has been clear moves, political moves to suspend funding to UNRWA based on unsubstantiated allegations. There have been legislation banning UNRWA from operating in the occupied territories. There has been physical targeting of UNRWA's facilities and staff, and has been a very active propaganda campaign against UNRWA workers based on allegations that are not substantiated, that some of the staff from UNRWA has been involved in the attacks of Hamas. And this has become also the basis of a significant change in relation to the capacity of UNRWA to operate. So the main key research findings of the paper are more or less organized in these four ideas. There is a dynamic tension reality. So that rather than an evolutionary progress from old to new humanitarianism, this clearly coexists in continuous tension. So classical principles remain relevant, but integrated programming is also very clear. Classical principles have gained renewed significance, but have also increased political targeting. So being neutral is not necessarily a way to be out of targeting from the belligerent parts, especially in the case of Gaza by the Israeli defense forces. So the UNRWA systematic targeting correlates with political integration. UNRWA's capacity to deliver assistance is continuing despite these constraints. And this demonstrates that classical approaches also remain essential. And there is a clear need to shield humanitarian action from geopolitical interference while maintaining space for principled engagement. So the challenge here is to reconcile protection with longer-term goals. So in our view, UNRWA embodies this fundamental tension between humanitarian minimalism based on principles that provides protection through neutrality and a more developmental maximalism that addresses root causes but increases political vulnerability. Just a final reflection, the struggle, in our view, the struggle for UNRWA survival represents a broader battle for what we call the soul of humanitarianism. Whether it will maintain its foundation in universal human dignity or become fully subordinated to geopolitical calculations is the main question. And the imperative of preserving humanitarian space for defenseless civilian populations becomes central to understanding effective humanitarian action in contemporary conflict. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry if I took too much time.
Okay,